Well, welcome everyone to the latest CMI podcast. This time we're going to talk about who was Cain's wife. Now, I'm Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, and with me is Dr. Rob Carter. Welcome.
Thanks, Jono. Good to be here.
Well, thanks again for your assist there, especially as you're an expert in genetics, and this is going to be very relevant to what we're talking about. But this has been a common skeptical objection for quite a while, raised as something Christians have never thought of. But what is the actual problem here? Couldn't Cain have just married into one of the other people groups around the place? What's the problem with that view?
This question actually has a lot of background material that maybe we should cover because some people might not be aware of what we're talking about. Okay.
Well, the issue is the Bible says Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel. Cain, of course, is a murderer of Abel, but also it talks about Cain having children. So whom did he marry?
And since the Bible says Adam and Eve are the only people around, it seems to be a contradiction that just a short time later, now all of a sudden, Cain's got a wife and he's worried about people are going to kill him because he killed his brother.
And so why couldn't there have been other people around, do you think?
That's a good question. In fact, this goes way back. This is part of the Scopes Monkey trial. It was famously part of that terribly inaccurate movie and play called Inherit the Wind.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
Modern people, younger people today, they don't ask this question nearly as much. But, back over the decades, this is a question we got asked often.
Well, certainly our predecessors in the creation apologetic were saying this is the most commonly asked question. It's not quite so much in our experience nowadays. But the issue seems to be, well, the Bible talks about Adam as the first man explicitly.
Yeah. So then how could Cain have a wife?
And Eve was the mother of all living. So clearly there weren't any para-Adamic people, pre-Adamites around. They were the only people. So where did he get his wife from then? What's the answer?
Well, the answer theologically is quite simple. He married his sister or his niece or his grandniece or his great-grandniece, but one of the females around at the time.
Oh, but I thought Adam and Eve only had Cain and Abel.
That's the big issue. The Bible says Adam and Eve had Cain, then they had Abel, and then when Adam was 130, they had a third son named Seth.
Yep.
Well, that sounds like that's the birth order. And it sounds like Cain's going to have to wait an awfully long time for a sister to be born, but then he's got a family and he's building a city. So the answer actually is asking the question, how old was Cain when he killed Abel? There wrote an article about this. It's on creation.com. And so how old was he? Well, the answer is we don't know, but how much time did he have?
Right. And also it says Adam and Eve had Seth, but they also had other sons and daughters, which people usually forget about, but it's very clear in Genesis 5:4, other sons and daughters, and presumably a lot of them were around at the time when Seth was born, do you think?
Eve names Seth essentially replacement, for he replaced the son who had died. So he is the first son born after Abel dies. But Cain and Abel could have been up to 130 years old.
Wow, that's a long time to have
they
a
could
family.
Have been great-great-grandparents by then.
Whoa.
It's not like, Cain, Abel, Seth, and then in some future distant, there's some daughter. But even if that was true, that still wouldn't be a problem because, okay, so the Bible is semi-chronological here, but we're skipping over centuries of information. And so it just says, Cain had a wife and they built a city. That could have been 200, 300, 400 years later.
That's quite a lot of time that people don't seem to realize, but it's also interesting when you look at the history of how Christian apologists throughout the ages have discussed this. They were also well aware that Cain logically had to marry a sister. Theodoret in the 5th century, Bishop of Cyrus, and then much later in the Reformation, Martin Luther said, well, yeah, he married a sister. But then there are usually two main objections to that. There's a moral one and a scientific one. So what's the moral objection to Cain marrying a sister then?
Well, incest is illegal. Incest is gross. Incest is contrary to the Bible.
So how could this have happened then? What's the issue? How do we solve this problem?
Well, what we do is we look in Scripture to see when did incest become illegal? And the answer is the time of Moses, thousands of years after creation.
So basically, God doesn't make ex post facto law. It couldn't have been sinful until God said it was sinful.
Yeah.
So why was it okay back in Cain's time, but not okay in Moses' time? In fact, it was actually okay in Abraham's time because Abraham married a half-sister.
That's right, he did.
And God blessed that marriage, right?
That's right. And then Jacob married his two cousins, first cousins.
And the Messiah came from that line.
That's right. In fact, after that, between Terah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that family had intermarried 3 or 4 generations in a row.
My goodness, that's quite startling. People don't normally realize that, do they?
A shocking amount of inbreeding there. Well, we are seeing some issues pop up, though.
We are, okay.
Because, Sarah couldn't have children. Took a miraculous intervention of God.
Yeah.
Rebecca only had 2.
And took a long time to have those two as well,
Took a long time. Of those 2, Esau's covered in hair. It's called the Wolfman gene, if you had the modern version of that.
Wow, okay.
So he's got an issue there. Then we have Leah, who has weak eyes, whatever that means, we don't know, but she's not desirable as a partner. And then her sister, Rachel dies in her second attempt at childbirth.
After a long time getting pregnant the first time. Right?
After struggling to get pregnant the first time. So we're seeing issues pop up here, genetic issues
okay.
in the Bible.
So on a genetic basis, what's actually causing those genetic issues with inbreeding? What's the problem today, say, with brother marrying a close relative like a sister? What's the issue here?
Well, today, the human population is carrying millions of what are called deleterious or bad mutations.
Which, what's a mutation?
It's a change in the DNA code. So we have this recipe book that says, here's how to build a person. It's called the human genome. We each carry 2 copies of it. And every once in a while, as a mother or a father manufactures a new code for the child, a mistake happens.
Right.
A little spelling error, essentially. And they're no big deal, usually, most of them.
Why would that be? Because the mutation's only on one of those halves and not on the other, so you've got a backup copy, sort of.
Yeah, because God engineered us with a backup copy, which is really, really good sound engineering design principle.
Oh, it's redundancy.
Yeah, redundancy. Good. That's why we're still alive. If we only had one copy of the genome, the human race would already be extinct.
Oh, goodness, that's serious stuff.
But because every time something breaks, we have a backup copy, we keep on trucking. Problem is, when you marry someone closely related to you, there's a higher probability that both of you are carrying a mutation and that both of you could pass that mutation to a child. And then they have 2 copies of the mutation, and they're usually not as fit or robust, or at least we could say a lot of times you can't notice anything, but when it does appear, the double dose of that mutation will harm the child.
And I think we see it in other animals, don't we? Like purebred dogs compared to the mongrel bits, as we say in Australia, bits of everything. And there's a purebreds that seem to have these problems, same sort of reasoning, you think?
Yeah, purebred animals across the spectrum, doesn't matter what species we're talking about, they have a lot of problems with mutations. And we have to be very careful looking at the bloodlines, trying to, like they got hip dysplasia out of the German Shepherd. Took a long time, and I think they still pop up every once in a while. One of the classic examples of inbreeding is King Carlos II of Spain.
Okay.
The end of the Spanish Habsburgs. After many, many generations of this family interbreeding, he turned up with 2 different mutations at the same time.
Ooh.
He couldn't close his mouth. He couldn't actually chew food. His teeth didn't meet.
Oh, gosh, that sounds
And he was mentally not quite there. And his death triggered what's called the War of the Spanish Succession.
Oh, that was serious stuff, yeah.
Yeah, so we see inbreeding has actually, societal level impacts here.
Wow.
But God didn't put a restriction on it until the time of Moses, 1500 BC, after thousands of years of mutations had accumulated.
Right, so you think Cain and Abel and Seth would not have had this problem then?
No, there would have been no problem marrying your sister because there's no mutations in the population yet. Just like after the flood, Noah's grandchildren, they would have had to have married each other. There's nobody else around. And it wasn't a problem, except we do see the lifespan plummet.
And you think so? The inbreeding actually had an effect on that lifespan, even that early stage then?
Yeah, because there would have been some mutations around, and we would have lost some percentage of the diversity from before the flood. on the ark, because it's only 6 people, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. That's it. That's the rest of humanity. They can't carry every single gene. Then they just start inbreeding like crazy.
So, but why wouldn't Cain have had many mutations? Why would Adam and Eve have had mutations, you think?
Because when God created Adam and Eve, he pronounced creation very good. There's no sin yet in the world. There's no death in the world. There's no suffering in the world. Everything is very good, which means it's perfect.
And the mutations are copying mistake.
Yes, they're
and
errors.
God doesn't make mistakes.
That's right. Now, that doesn't mean that Adam and Eve didn't have any genetic diversity, but it does mean they weren't carrying the genes for hereditary blindness or sickle cell anemia or any one of the other great number of mutations that we see in the human population today.
And that's something you would have discussed in your previous podcasts with Keaton Halley on Adam and Eve and genetics, right? So if you want to look up, you guys, on our podcast channel, see the previous podcasts on Adam and Eve. So the issue seems to be Adam and Eve had no mutations at all when they were created, so therefore Cain and Abel probably had none, and the sister probably had hardly any as well. And so you're saying by the time of Abraham and his family, this was 2,000 years later, you've got problems already surfacing now. In fact, in the flood 1,600 years later, you've pointed out this huge drop of lifespan because of the forced inbreeding between the 6 people who are still breeding after the flood. So by the time of Moses, you're talking about another 500 years or so.
At least, yeah.
And then you think this issue of inbreeding was going to become a problem.
Yeah, well, it was already a problem some places. When we look at Neanderthals, they're scattered across from Spain to Siberia.
Wow, that's a long range.
Huge range, and there's never many of them. Only a few thousand Neanderthals at the most, as the population geneticists have estimated.
Okay.
But when we look at them, they're the most inbred population we've ever seen.
And you can tell from the fossils that the inbreeding produced some problems then?
Yes, and we also can tell from their DNA.
Okay.
They're carrying a lot of bad mutations, some of which appear in modern humans and cause disease.
Okay.
They're also, their heterozygosity level is way down.
What does that mean?
It means that they have a very high likelihood of having 2 identical pieces of DNA from their mother and their father, which means their mother and their father are closely related.
And that means they could also inherit the same mutation from mother and father. Oopsie, that's not very good for them.
Exactly. So they were getting really hammered by this mutation accumulation problem that we're seeing in people today, even though there's 7 billion of us. It's been a long time for mutations to accumulate in the human population. And across the world, we are actually laboring under this problem.
Oh, we are?
Yeah. But it wasn't a problem in the garden.
Right.
So the inbreeding question with Cain is irrelevant. The where'd Cain get his wife question is easily answered scripturally. It's actually not a problem. It's just when you just take a 10,000 foot view and just skim through Genesis really quickly.
Right.
Oh, wait a minute, how'd this happen? How'd this work? But the answer is trivial.
I'm struck by how often these atheists or critics bring up a problem and think the Christians have never even thought about it. But then you can go back hundreds and even over 1,000 years and find that Christian experts have actually already thought about this problem. There's a sort of lack of respect for historical precedent around, sadly, some parts of the church, but also a lot of the atheist attackers.
Yeah, but that's how it works, isn't it? You throw out an easy question. If the person doesn't know it, it looks like a hard question.
That's true. So the lesson is to be very well prepared as much as you can be.
Yes, study to show thyself approved.
Right, there you go. And presumably God has produced this law against incest to actually protect us to some extent.
Yes, it's a good protection also, because if we were allowed to marry people very closely related, and there's some cultures in the world today where first cousin marriages are very common.
Right.
It would actually have an impact on our health and well-being and our pocketbooks, because it would be impacting the health systems.
In fact, Darwin married a first cousin, if I recall, too.
And every one of her brothers and every one of her sisters also married first cousins.
Oh, goodness, really? Very much the Wedgwood and Darwin families. Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
And did that produce any problems that you know of?
Darwin lamented the fact that he shouldn't have married his cousin.
Oh, he regretted it.
He talked about in animal breeding how close matings are very often bad.
Oh, okay. So this problem was known before they even worked out genetics with Gregor Mendel. They actually knew there was still a problem with close.
Yeah, but they did it anyway. One of the reasons to do this, by the way, is just to keep money in the family.
Okay.
You know, two brothers sit down, hey, your daughter marries my son, and, you know, their kids inherit the estate. So financially and practically, it makes a lot of sense, but it's just a really bad idea.
And hence that probably with royals as well, doing the same sort of thing, keeping it in the family.
Yeah. So, yeah, Darwin had a lot of kids.
Some of them died young, though.
Yeah, many of them died young. I think only, out of the 10 kids, I think only 3 went on to have kids of their own.
So there is a Darwin descendant family, but there were a few casualties on the way, it sounds like.
Yes.
So the summary answer to this is that Cain married his sister. That's unavoidable, but it wasn't.
Or niece.
But the niece, where the niece come from, you think? Brother, sister, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So
one of his brothers married one of his sisters, and he could have married a niece.
That makes sense too, yeah, that's possible. But you can't escape the brother-sister into marriage. Must have been an issue.
Absolutely has to be true.
And as you pointed out, it wasn't an issue morally because God hadn't prohibited it.
That's right.
And also not an issue biologically because the mutation load was very low at the time. But it's an issue now, and God has said, don't do it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. And make sure to tune in for future podcasts, but also look at the related resources that we recommend for further reading. There's also a related podcast on this issue by Dr. Carter on the genetics of Adam and Eve, but also look at some of the related articles below this video. Thank you very much for watching.